The following documentary deals with subjects that may upset certain members in the audience, as it presents possible interpretations of historic facts. The conclusions presented here are a matter of opinion. The evidence is real. In the early 15th century, there lived an artist by the name of Leonardo da Vinci. He was an unparalleled pioneer in both arts and science. And even though many of his works, writings, and discoveries have been lost, what has reached us still bedazzles and baffles us and guides us in our quest for further knowledge.
Given he was such a unique character, we have reason to believe that these dark periods were the richest, the boldest, and his most defiant. This same darkness envelops his possible relationship with one of the most enigmatic objects of all time, the Shroud of Turin, or the Holy Shroud, the cloth in which Jesus' body was supposedly wrapped from the time of his death until the resurrection, a cloth that bears the marks of each of Jesus' wounds, a cloth whose authenticity science has neither been able to confirm or deny. Today the cloth is jealously guarded at the cathedral in Turin. Where do the paths of Leonardo da Vinci and the Shroud of Turin cross? When studying the many worlds of Leonardo, it seems inevitable to uncover a theory so bold that it seems based on boundless admiration for his genius, rather than reliable historical evidence. This theory, which has gained popularity in recent years, holds that Leonardo was the creator of the Holy Shroud. Indeed, it goes further and maintains that the face imprinted on the shroud is that of Leonardo himself.
Little is known for sure about the Holy Shroud. One thing is for certain, though. If it were a forgery, it must have been carried out by someone with manifold talents in many disciplines: chemistry or alchemy, anatomy, religious history and optics. Someone close to the powers that be, and with a very good reason to carry it out. Someone like Leonardo da Vinci.
Does the assertion that somebody could have done something necessarily imply that they did in fact do it? Or is this just the stubborn vision of those keen to give the genius Leonardo da Vinci credit for any stunning feat? Do these theories have any weight? Or are they just simply mad fantasies? Conspiracies constructed for bestsellers? To find the possible juncture between the Holy Shroud and Leonardo da Vinci, we must first follow the paths of both. On the one hand, the history of the Shroud, to find out exactly what it is, and to see what science and history have to say about it. And on the other, Leonardo, to analyze the artistic and scientific experiments that he carried out at the time the Shroud reappeared in Europe. And finally, to dare to believe. Let's explore then the mysterious path of the Holy Shroud.
The Holy Shroud is a winding sheet bearing the image of a human body, presumably the image of Jesus' body when he was taken down from the cross. The markings are entirely consistent with the biblical story of Jesus' martyrdom.
What's chilling about the Holy Shroud is that it bears the impression of the blood-stained body of Jesus after it was taken down from the cross. Even today, the scene is stirring. The storm had passed. The soldiers had gone. 3 men were dead. All that was left were the mourners. But the universe marched on, and the most powerful religion in the West was emerging.
Jesus of Nazareth, the preacher of peace and mercy, underwent an ordeal that lasted 12 hours. The shroud is mentioned in the Bible, and for the faithful, it is irrefutable physical evidence of his martyrdom and resurrection. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb that had been cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Three days later, the miracle of resurrection took place. According to the Gospels, all that was found in Jesus' tomb was the white cloth in which his body had been wrapped. This cloth was carefully kept by the followers of the Messiah. The Holy Shroud. Still carefully kept in Turin Cathedral, Italy, the shroud is displayed to the public only once every 20 years.
Throughout history, the Holy Shroud has been considered responsible for a large number of supernatural occurrences. This stems from its miraculous creation, when it touched the body of the Lord before he ascended into the kingdom of heaven.
From the 1st century and on into the present, Jews have used winding sheets very similar to the Holy Shroud. What sets this piece of cloth apart is that it bears traits and details that match the biblical story of Jesus' martyrdom.
From a religious perspective, it's logical to think that God would preserve the shroud as evidence of his Son's suffering at the hands of man, to remind us of his love for us and to call us to repent, a detailed and vivid memory.
A stream of blood caused by a wound and a cut to the abdomen can be detected across the shroud. This blood stain grows thicker under the elbow, and from there it goes on to the chest. 2 trails of blood cut across the lower back, where there is a white stain of cadaverous blood, which evidences how the body was moved during the preparation for burial. On the arms, there are marks from wounds that could have been caused by iron nails buried in the wrists. The body bears marks of more than 100 lashes. Some researchers have spoken of up to 120. These marks were inflicted by 2 executioners using whips tipped with leaden balls, the same sort of whip that Romans used to flagellate prisoners at that time. Several dark stains suggest that blood ran down both the front and the back of the head, consistent with the bleeding caused by the crown of thorns described in the New Testament.
A miracle is defined as an event which transcends the known laws of nature, attributable to divine supernatural intervention. What kind of energy could have created such a clear, detailed and incorrupt print?
Though never officially accepted by the Church, there is a version of how the shroud came to be that has been tolerated as a possible explanation. It posits that God the Father approached the body of Jesus at the moment of resurrection, and there was a mighty caloric blast which solarized the image of the Son on the linen that sheltered him. Somehow, that same energy must have prevented the incineration of the canvas as proof of Jesus' holiness.
But even if that were true, even if God had left his indelible mark on the cloth that wrapped the body of his Son, can we be sure that the shroud that's in Turin is the same one that wrapped the body of Jesus. To confirm this, we need to trace the history of the shroud from the time of the crucifixion to the time it appeared in Turin. A task that requires equal measures of history, legend, and faith.
According to the Gospels, after Jesus' resurrection, the shroud was guarded by the early Christians. Very little is known about the first part of the shroud's journey. The records that do exist are merely speculations, random versions, and unrelated pieces of information that have never been confirmed. It is said that in the year 535, a piece of cloth known as the Mandilion, allegedly bearing the image of Jesus, was found hidden in the walls of a church in Edessa, Turkey. No one knows if this was the Holy Shroud, a common handkerchief, or just a legend. In 726, it is mentioned again, this time by Saint John of Damascus, who also found it in Edessa, which was then occupied by the Muslims. In 944, a piece of canvas called the Holy Mandilion is recovered by Romanus Lacapinus, who besieged Edessa. With great pomp, it is solemnly transferred to Constantinople, where it is displayed. In April 1204, the Crusaders plunder Constantinople and apparently recover the Holy Shroud. Nonetheless, shortly after the siege, it was lost track of once again. The documented history of the shroud begins in 1349, when it is in the hands of the French nobleman Geoffroy de Charny, who is presumed to have bought it in Constantinople. The canvas is then passed on to his grandson. When he dies, his widow, Jeanne de Vergy, begins to exhibit it as a source of income. Everyone wanted to see it, touch it, and kneel before the miracle that was already 13 centuries old.
But in the year 1370, the authenticity of the shroud was seriously questioned by high-ranking church officials. They didn't like the commercial use of this miracle. In the same year, the important Bishop of Troyes, Henri de Poitiers, forbade Jean de Vergy from displaying the shroud, claiming it was a forgery. Years later, the widow remarried the uncle of the anti-Pope of Avignon, Clement VII, and gained authorization to ignore the bishop's orders and restart exhibiting the shroud. However, a new bishop, Pierre d'Arquis, also opposed the exhibition and confronted Clement VII, who in turn condemned him to perpetual silence at the risk of excommunication. Faced with this turn of events, the bishop sent the Pope his famous Memorando d'Arquis, which states,
This skillfully painted canvas was produced to attract crowds in order to subtly take the money. The canvas was painted with guile. The truth was erased by the artist himself.
Clement VII held firm in his authorization, but on the condition that the public be warned that the shroud could be a forgery.
In order to avoid fraud, he who displays the shroud must warn the people gathered in a loud and clear voice that this figure or representation is not the true shroud of our Lord, but rather a painting or picture of the shroud that is said to have been the shroud of the Lord Jesus Christ. Clement VII.
This is a critical moment in our study for two main reasons. Firstly, it confirms that the authenticity of the shroud goes back to its first recorded history. Indeed, two bishops discredited it in the late 1300s, one of them even going so far as to confront the Pope of Avignon to denounce this ploy. The second point is even more intriguing. If the relic was so crude in the 14th century, are we talking about the same cloth whose authenticity, even in the 21st century, has neither been proved or denied by countless experts and scientists?
It would seem that the Holy Shroud fake of 1370 was so obvious and crude that it could be detected quite readily. But the shroud that is today kept in the church in Turin has passed, or at least confused, all of the tests it has undergone. Myriad studies and advanced technology have produced contradictory results, making it impossible to establish with certainty the shroud's origins, true age, or how it was carried out.
Evidently, the mysterious shroud that is currently guarded in Turin is not the same as the one that was called a sideshow attraction by a cleric in 1370. Even more strangely, in the 15th century, all official opposition to the shroud ceased. Papal documents were produced confirming its authenticity. And the church even ended up housing it, as it does today. The moment at which the church's attitude to the shroud changed is not a minor consideration. It is just the first of many keys that open up the door to our fascinating theory. In the same age that crude relic was replaced by the shroud that we have today, a genius named Leonardo da Vinci was living and working.
Already worshipped for generations, the Holy Shroud was photographed for the first time by an Italian citizen, Secondo Pia, in 1898. He was a prestigious Catholic lawyer, closely connected with ecclesiastic power and royalty. That first photograph, which was taken using a primitive box camera and large glass plates instead of film, revealed an unexpected fact that has still not been explained. The photograph's glass negative revealed a positive image with extremely precise details that had never been seen before. The wounds, the bloodstains, and Jesus' bereaved visage.
Thus the controversy began. If the negative of a photograph of the Holy Shroud showed a clear black and white image, then it could be said that the shroud itself was a perfect photographic negative. An image projected on a canvas and then fixed through a chemical process. This is then the first sign of a highly sophisticated trick. Let's see what others might await us.
Since that first photograph by Secondo Pia, close to 1,000 scientific investigations of the shroud have been performed and, according to official information, it has been photographed more than 32,000 times. If we take into account all of the studies that have been performed on the Holy Shroud, we can come up with the following summary. The differences between the texture of the image of the body and of the bloodstains suggest that they were applied to the fabric at different times. Nonetheless, they have a similar style. This is particularly striking in the head area. There we notice that the drops of blood produced by the crown of thorns are particularly similar, as if they had been traced. Stranger still is the fact that these marks never mix with the outline of the hair. There are no blood clots in the hair. It is as if the drops had been superimposed on an earlier drawing of the head. Though not a painting, still we see an image. There are traces of blood, but it does not seem to be dye or coloring. Both the lighter and the seemingly thicker areas are printed on the canvas with the same thickness and density. The image of Jesus is not readily visible. Instead, it has been solarized. The impression has all the traits of some sort of primitive photography.
To truly investigate the depths of the matter, we must close our eyes to faith and analyze the Holy Shroud from the perspective of science, cold eyes, secular mind. From this perspective, the Holy Shroud loses much of its original impact. Details emerge that make it seem like a primitive, and very convincing show of special effects. An immaculate staging of a topic which caused a stir from the very beginning, but in whose production signs of the human hand are visible. Let's suppose then that at a certain point in the 15th century, it was decided to replace the ancient and easily refutable shroud with the current one, which is yet to be understood. What knowledge would the person who dared to produce such a hoax require? Are we perhaps speaking of a genius?
If someone had set out to replace the shroud in order to make it more credible or less vulnerable to domestication, the first thing to do was to come up with a kind of printing that did not entail brushstrokes or any similar markings. The craftsman would have to be capable of reproducing the marks left by a bleeding human body, a body with very specific characteristics on the canvas that enveloped it. These marks would have to reflect exactly all of the torments which, according to the Bible, were inflicted on Jesus' body. Of course, he would have to be capable of recreating a face imagined by many. He would have to balance precision with vagueness in order to excite the imagination. And, finally, he would have to know how to treat the canvas to preserve it over time.
Strangely enough, there's not a single depiction of Jesus' death in Leonardo's pictorial work, though this is a recurring theme for artists throughout history. Leonardo did, however, paint the Annunciation, the Adoration of the Magi, the Virgin of the Rocks, and the Last Supper. Biblical scenes that in many cases were taken to be the official version of the events they depicted. Despite its emotional charge and expressive potential, the death of Jesus was not included among Leonardo's body of work. This may have been a chance omission, but it seems strange that he never painted this scene. Or did he? Or was the crucifixion his greatest ever experiment, a piece where he could combine art, science, and religion? If this was the case, he never let this piece come to light.
So far, all we have learned in relation to the shroud and Leonardo is that the Church, who had openly called the shroud a forgery 100 years earlier, suddenly stopped questioning it at the same time that Leonardo was alive. But while suggestive, this is hardly conclusive. But without pointing a finger at Leonardo, if we assume for a moment that the shroud displayed in Turin is a forgery, we are faced with a series of provocative questions. How was it possible to collect the diverse array of knowledge necessary to create a hoax that would fool generations of believers? And how to carry out such a feat and prevent any knowledge, any rumor from getting out throughout history? And why create such a forgery? If we can answer these questions, we will find that the circle tightens, and it becomes more and more plausible to connect the fates of Leonardo da Vinci and the Holy Shroud.
Not many people in the late 15th century brought together the array of knowledge necessary to carry out such a feat. Judging from the writings of Leonardo that have been preserved, he was one. These writings indicate that Leonardo was not only a consummate artist, but also a scientist with a mystical bent.
What was Leonardo really after in all his research? We know that he understood nature, and that man was a perfect piece of machinery, but one which could be recreated. But he wanted to go beyond, to understand the mechanism of the soul. Was God really present in all things? Where did the limit of knowledge lie?
Leonardo was certainly an expert in religion and religious art. Many of his pieces have become the official versions of the scenes from the Gospels. He knew every detail of Christian history, and he could transfer them to the canvas better than anyone else. But In addition to his expertise in art and religion, he had a deep scientific knowledge of the human body. His secret studies of cadavers had made him a consummate anatomist.
Leonardo da Vinci, unmatchable artist and expert anatomist, perhaps the person of his generation with the greatest knowledge of the human body, and certainly the one who best portrayed it. But was his knowledge of art and anatomy great enough to create a forgery of the shroud? In terms of the visual arts, we can certainly say that it was. But as we have seen, the shroud that is guarded in Turin is not a painting. Instead, it has the traits of a primitive photographic image. And this is where the paths of Leonardo da Vinci and the shroud begin to cross. For it's in Leonardo's studies of light that you find the possible technical resolution of the Shroud of Turin.
Leonardo's experiments with light are well known. He designed the first camera obscura, a sealed room where an inverted image could be captured through a tiny hole in the wall. It is also known that he designed machines to polish lenses, which he later built and tested successfully. One of his goals was to write a paper on the science of optics. Never had anyone taken these experiments so far, because no other artist had taken the time to study the human eye and light as meticulously as Leonardo. We would clear up many of the mysteries of this world if we knew more about light, as the eye is faster than the mind. Leonardo da Vinci.
His perception of the world was overwhelmingly visual. That's why Leonardo found vision such a compelling topic. After all, the whole world is contained in the eye, in an aperture no larger than a dot. To whom could the word visionary apply, if not to Leonardo? And how can we fail to understand his desperation to relate the world around him to the mind that perceived it?
While his hands feverishly sketched what his eyes saw, his restless mind could not stop observing the miracle of vision itself. Eyes, light, image, how to arrest an image. Above all, how to preserve a fleeting gesture. Capture a real second on canvas. The basis of painting, but also the essence of photography. Of course, Leonardo's obsession with vision and optical principles soon led him to mirrors. He carried out all sorts of experiments with mirrors, pushing the possibilities to the limit.
Mirrors were a scientific tool that Leonardo used in all his activities. Mirrors helped him master the art of backwards writing, a skill that helped him hide his most dangerous discoveries. He also used mirrors for his portraits. He would draw the face of his subject onto a mirror and later transfer those lines to the canvas.
A road that would invariably lead him to the knowledge needed to take a photograph. But the road was a long one. In the 15th century, light, vision, and reflection were ungraspable phenomena, deep mysteries to be unraveled.
The phenomenon of reflection intrigued him. Likewise, the duplicated image aroused his sense of imagination and mystic sensibility. Leonardo could spend days watching a ray of light hit water at different hours, light bouncing off a wall, or the reflection of his own face. For him, these were invitations to explore. Many asked what Leonardo was wasting his time on now.
Once, with the help of his apprentices and students, he constructed an octagonal room whose walls were completely covered with mirrors. Anyone in the center of the room would see his image repeated in all directions. A challenge to consciousness, a fierce stimulus to the imagination. Every image had its complete opposite, its conflicting complement: light, darkness. Every certainty leads to a new question.
Leonardo watched his image reflecting, time and again. Only before the labyrinth of his own effigy did he feel his creative powers grow, multiplying both inside and out. Leonardo tried to determine which of the individuals looking at him, individuals who were all identical to him, was the most real. And along with his image, the questions multiplied. How many lives do we live in infinite time? Could this signify time?
Each one is reflected in the next. As in the mirrors, one image reaches the next. It bounces, returns, and so on to infinity. Leonardo da Vinci. Time and again, Leonardo returned to his mirrors. For him, they held many different meanings. As a painter, mirrors were an indispensable tool for copying models and manipulating light. As a rationalist, they were a symbol of human intelligence, an instrument for self-knowledge.
In his notebooks, Leonardo describes using mercury in mirrors to perfect the image and the quality of the crystal. The study of light was one of Leonardo's greatest obsessions. For him, the pleasure of vision demonstrated the power of the human eye. It was in this way that he came to study the mechanism of vision so carefully. He found strange analogies in it with the world of mirrors. How far did he really go in his experiments? How much of what he did has reached us? How much information was lost in some obscure European attic?
The key to understanding the possible link between Leonardo and the Holy Shroud are his experiments with camera obscuras, lenses, and mirrors. Although there are known precedents of research in all of these fields, there is no record of any other person from that time who had delved so deeply into this subject. Such knowledge would prove basic and necessary when it came to carrying out a primitive photographic experiment like, perhaps, the Shroud of Turin.
Optics, anatomy, art, religion. Leonardo possessed all the knowledge necessary to create a human image on a canvas. All he needed to know was how to fix that image. And so we come to Leonardo the alchemist, the Leonardo of the Vitruvian man, obsessed with the secret of the universe, the divine proportion, the quintessence of all things.
In their search for the elixir of life eternal, the panacea, and the philosopher's stone, alchemists were the ancestors of modern chemists. Their experimentation with diverse substances led them to master different reactions and combinations which, bared of the magical element, were useful for other, more mundane purposes. Centuries before Leonardo, Arab and Greek necromancers had discovered that, when exposed to light, nitrate and silver chloride reacted by growing darker. Indeed, this same chemical phenomenon was used by Daguerre in the 19th century to invent his daguerreotype, the first known photographic technique we have historical record of.
Let's recap. At a given point in the 15th century, the Holy Shroud, once considered just a sideshow attraction, was accepted by the very church that had tried to discredit it. Even today, it still baffles scientists and experts. This leads us to believe that the original shroud was replaced by a more credible version, which, according to the conclusions of recent scientific studies, was a primitive photographic experiment. At the same time, Leonardo da Vinci was perhaps the only person with the relevant knowledge of optics, anatomy, religious art, and chemistry to be able to perform such a feat. But we're still missing one crucial ingredient: the motive. Why would Leonardo da Vinci risk his freedom and his reputation to perform such a hoax? And more importantly, who would have benefited from it?
Europe at that time was a theocratic society. Owning a sacred relic like the shroud was a valuable sign of power, capable of rising the prestige of any noble family. Its mere existence could strengthen the church's influence on people. Both noblemen and the church were Leonardo's patrons and regular clients. They admired his talent, but also knew that the artist needed their favor. It is not unlikely, then, that a more credible shroud would have been commissioned to Leonardo, practically like the development of a secret political weapon.
The shroud is not the only example of a holy relic used to reaffirm faith. In almost all the churches in Europe, we find the bones of saints, nails and splinters from the cross, and other palpable evidence of Christian faith. It's not easy to become an approved relic. The church itself takes charge of unmasking supposed miracles that arise at its very heart. But when a myth like the Holy Shroud takes on a certain magnitude, it becomes much harder to discredit.
There are many holy relics, and while the shroud is one of the most incredible and most questioned, every stage of the Calvary seems to have produced an object of veneration. Veronica's veil, which Jesus used to wipe his face on the way to Golgotha, is kept in a monastery near the town of Pescara in the Italian region of Abruzzo. Catholic sources state that the features imprinted on the veil match the ones on the Turin shroud. The holy tunic, which clothed the Messiah until the moment of crucifixion, the same one the soldiers drew lots for after his death. Today, two churches claim to own it. One is the French church of Argenteuil. It is said that tunic has stains like those found on the shroud. In the German city of Trier, there is another holy shroud, apparently found in Jerusalem by Saint Helena. She donated the tunic to the city. There, her son, the Emperor Constantine, kept it in a cathedral that was constructed especially for that purpose. Since the 16th century, it has been displayed on a regular basis. The remains of the Holy Cross are distributed amongst Rome, the Vatican, Spain, and Turkey. Over the centuries, various popes have given pieces and splinters of the cross to churches around the world. In the early 6th century, Pope Saint Gregory the Great gave a major section of the cross to Recared the Visigoth, King of Spain. The crown of thorns is also a relic, and several thorns are kept in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The nails from the crucifixion are also found in various European churches and cathedrals, although in such numbers that it is impossible for all of them to be authentic. There are also doubts regarding the nail said to be in the shaft of one of St. Longinus' spears.
St. Longinus' spear is a particularly interesting icon. Later converted, Longinus was the centurion who opened up the wound on Jesus' side, from which blood and water flowed. There are 4 known spears in existence. One of them might be authentic. The first is in the Vatican. Sultan Bayezid II gave it to Pope Innocent VII, who was a contemporary of Leonardo's. The second is in Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Pope Benedict XIV declared it authentic in the 18th century. The third is worshipped in Krakow in Poland. The fourth spear was a powerful talisman for Constantine the Great, for the French king Charles Martel, for Charlemagne, and for the Emperor Federico Barbarossa. It is now kept in Vienna, in Austria.
Each relic served in turn as currency exchanged by different power fractions. But the Holy Shroud is probably the most dazzling of them all. Because of its size, its raw details, and mostly because it is graphic testimony of the greatest miracle of all, the resurrection. Now worshipped by hundreds of thousands of people, it is difficult to imagine the value this relic might have had 500 years ago, when the Enlightenment of the Renaissance man posed a serious threat to faith.
All it takes is the most basic arithmetics to establish that the number of relics in existence is far greater than the number in the biblical story. So one might ask, how many artists have made a living by making and restoring relics? Is it irrational to think that the shroud might be one of them? A copy, a version, or the perfecting of a flawed forgery? And if the Holy Shroud mentioned in the Bible really did exist, what happened to it?
Perhaps time and constant contact with the elements had caused its disintegration. It might have been stolen or torn in battle, or perhaps it was destroyed by one of the many fires the relic allegedly suffered. 13 centuries of credible information about its whereabouts are missing, and there are innumerable accusations of forgery. One thing is for sure, however. In Leonardo's times, the late 15th century, the sudden appearance of a more credible shroud proved extremely beneficial for many.
Who had the Holy Shroud in Leonardo's time? Historical records tell us that it was in the hands of the House of Savoy, one of the most important noble families in Europe. But little else is known. The Savoys, powerful, noble, and well-connected. A nobility to whom, to put it metaphorically, Leonardo also belonged.
Leonardo had two Italian patrons, the Medicis in Florence, where he began his career, and the Sforzas in Milan, where he developed his optical experiments. Despite his humble origins as an illegitimate child, his enormous talent won him the appreciation of the most aristocratic circles of the day, and he was accepted as another member of the nobility. Leonardo rubbed elbows with the most powerful Italian families, who bickered to obtain even a small token of his genius.
The Medicis, the Sforzas, the Savoys. Upon reviewing the genealogy of these families, it becomes clear they're related. Two of them, the patrons of Leonardo. The third, the owners of the shroud. The number of signs grows. The paths begin to cross. But this is just the beginning.
While Leonardo was carrying out his optical experiments, the church was ruled by Pope Innocent VIII, who reigned from 1484 to 1492. Innocent VIII goes down in history as one of the weakest and most corrupt pontiffs ever. A pope who needed something to boast his power. Curiously, Innocent VIII was also intimately connected to the Medici. Their relations and dealings were frequent and complex. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, had his son Giovanni named cardinal by Pope Innocent VIII, though he was only 14 years of age. This was a way to ensure power and protection for his family. Years later, the young Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici would become Pope Leon X.
A weakened pope names the son of Leonardo's patrons as cardinal. Curious, and another sign in our search for evidence. Is it too far-fetched, then, To think that the shroud, irrefutable evidence of Christian faith and a powerful political weapon for the Pope, could have sealed an exchange of favours between Pope Innocent VII and the Medicis. We know for sure that the different power factions lent each other spies, soldiers, and even artists for all sorts of different assignments. Was this one of those cases? What other coincidences can we find when we study the political map of the period? Who else would have gained from this operation?
Understanding the relations between different power factions is fundamental to the Leonardo theory. The Savoia family, owners of the shroud, was related to the Medicis, who were, in turn, connected to Pope Innocent VIII, who named a Medici cardinal. The Savoyas were also related to the Sforzas, Medici, Sforza, two families who came together in a single artist, Leonardo da Vinci.
There are then several coincidences at a certain moment in time which lend credence to the Leonardo theory. When we track down the beneficiaries, we find the Pope, who would be strengthened from a credible relic that would help renew the faith of the people. The Savoys, who would now be the owners of a more authentic relic. The Medicis, who would receive favours from the Pope in return for having strengthened him. And the Sforzas, relatives of the Savoy family, whose relationship with the Pope had always been touchy.
It remains to be seen whether Leonardo was among the beneficiaries or not. Such a technical achievement should have been mentioned in his writings, but his notes make no reference to the shroud. Nor is there any record of large sums of money increasing Leonardo's patrimony, even though he most certainly would have been compensated for a work of this magnitude. Indeed, Leonardo depended on the generosity of the King of France in his final years. This would lead us to believe that, aside from his enormous ego, which would have been drawn to such a challenge, he had other motivations.
Leonardo once said it was the Medicis that made me and the Medicis that ruined me. That was the risk of being in the service of any of these powerful families.
Despite his prestige, Leonardo da Vinci was very susceptible to pressure. His incarceration for sodomy as a young man, the ambiguous nature of some of his religious scenes, his study of cadavers. It would not have been difficult to level an accusation against him or to have him burnt at the stake.
The nobles knew that they could pressurize Leonardo. But how could they have closed such a pact? It's time to bring together all the signs and the certainties and to dare to imagine such a scene. In what strange conclave could the Church have decided that the time had come to create a miracle to reaffirm faith? Who was responsible for communicating with the nobility? What sums were at stake? And who carried out the negotiation?
If this story, with its air of scandal, were true, Leonardo da Vinci was in the right place at the right time. Perhaps that is why, when someone had finally dared to utter the need to create or to copy a holy shroud, Leonardo's name would have been among the first mentioned to carry it out.
The meeting was in secret. The most daring artist of the age had received a proposition from powerful patrons, a proposition that was more dangerous to reject than to accept. Eventually, behind the passageways and the smoke of the torches, the powerful and the artist came face to face.
Maybe Da Vinci did not ask himself what science he was practicing when he performed an experiment. His hunger for knowledge surpassed all prejudice. There could be no immoral science. Curiosity was reason enough to carry out any task. And so he would have received this unexpected request, or perhaps demand. For, beyond the risks it might entail, it could also open the doors to new sciences.
Making a false shroud, improving the one that in 1370 had been questioned by 2 bishops, and suspiciously only defended by the Pope who was related to the widow who displayed it for money, rendering the brushstrokes invisible, making use of a new and unknown technique, a technique whose mechanisms and effects were dangerously evocative of magic. And this leads us once again to the subject of alchemy.
Setting an image on a canvas without using dyes required a deep knowledge of chemistry and the emulsions needed to achieve it. Nitrate, or maybe silver chlorine, substances mentioned in ancient writings on alchemy. Once again, these clues point to Leonardo, who was a master alchemist and, more strikingly, had been protected by the Medicis, who were closely linked to the forbidden science.
The Medici family protected the alchemists because one of their family was one. Giuliano was one of the great masters of the occult sciences, and Lorenzo Medici was a founder member of the Brotherhood of Magicians, one of the great lodges of Florence.
Lorenzo Medici had inherited his position from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather. The Confraternity of the Magi was not only a study center, it was also an important step for those who sought to gain power in Florence.
Let's move forward in our theory. Leonardo was faced with the greatest challenge of his life. What was he thinking when he looked at the white sheet in front of him? More than a future miracle, he probably saw it as a project that, though imperfect, deserved to be carried out. And he would take that risk. We know that Leonardo had the necessary knowledge to make the shroud. We also know that the political climate at the time was conducive to making a forgery, and that Leonardo was strategically placed amongst those who would benefit from a better relic. But it would not be honest to put forward the theory that Leonardo had created the Holy Shroud without trying to reconstruct the process, step by step, with the elements available at the time. Let's dare for a moment to reconstruct that scene.
The technique to produce silver nitrate was not overly complex. He needed the silver salts flooding the canvas at the right temperature, what we now call an emulsion. If the exposure time were correct, the light would draw a shadow of the original image on the light-sensitive surface. There was the key.
As we know, Leonardo da Vinci designed a camera obscura, perhaps the first in history. Let's suppose for a moment that he actually made it. That wouldn't seem too great a challenge for someone of his talent, and would be an essential element in recording an image on canvas.
It is possible to effect an approximate reconstruction of the process Leonardo might have used to make the Turin shroud, a task that would require him to combine his vast knowledge in new ways. After constructing the camera obscura, Leonardo must have sealed the room. Darkness inside, light outside. In this room, he would open a small single hole. When this orifice was opened and closed, a beam of light would enter the room, and the image outside the room would then appear, inverted. Leonardo's camera obscura would act as a primitive photographic camera. The mechanism was in place. All that remained to be done was to decide upon the image to copy and fix it on a canvas.
Leonardo was perhaps before the greatest experiment of his lifetime. We can imagine him checking, time and again, every component and step. If there were no unforeseen errors, it would have to work.
We can assume that the elements available to Leonardo at the time were capable of rendering a photographic image on a canvas. Emulsion, lenses, camera obscura, mirrors. Although photography was not officially discovered for 3 more centuries, in the 16th century there were no technical impediments to the process. Leonardo's knowledge of alchemy and his own inventions prove this.
Now he faced the complex problem of making a model, the perfect image of the dead prophet. Leonardo knew that the slightest error could result in condemnation, and yet the excitement of the challenge was far greater than any fear.
His knowledge of religious art, painting, and forensic sciences would have allowed him to carry out this task. Thanks to his numerous trips to the morgue and public executions, Leonardo knew perfectly well how flagellations and tracks of blood looked on a dead body. We can imagine that he grew even more excited as the time to perform the task approached, his bright eyes following his perfectly steady hand.
When he thought the time was right, he uncovered the hole and light flooded the cloth. As the hours went by, the canvas became covered in stains. But at one side, the most startling image began to appear, that of a man's face with shoulder-length hair.
Some state that the image on the shroud looks like Leonardo da Vinci's self-portraits. If these theories are true, Leonardo must have been of Semitic ancestry and had Semitic features. Like Jesus himself, the image of the shroud looks Semitic. This has been a strong argument against the theory of Leonardo's falsification. Leonardo was Italian and a Christian Catholic. Nonetheless, in recent years, surprising new information has come from the Museo Ideale Leonardo da Vinci, a museum housed in Leonardo's home in the town of Vinci. According to the museum's director, there is evidence in Leonardo's writing to uphold the idea that Caterina, his biological mother, was a slave from the Middle East, an Arab or a Jewess, but in either case, a Semite. More evidence that connects the shroud with Leonardo.
A portrait of God with Leonardo's features. Wouldn't this be the ultimate laugh at dogma? An act of extreme arrogance, worthy of an ingenious and pampered artist, or perhaps a silent revenge for having to accept a commission that he'd never be able to sign.
If this theory is true, his revenge would have been exquisitely perfect. For 5 centuries, the shroud bearing his face would have been worshipped and adored by the most passionate believers in a religion that Leonardo himself seriously questioned. For 5 centuries, thousands of faithful Christians would have kneeled before the image of the great trickster, the anatomist, alchemist, the miracle maker who did not believe in miracles.
We have finally found the possible intersection between Leonardo da Vinci and the shroud. The statement that Leonardo da Vinci was the craftsman behind the Shroud of Turin is as bold now as it was at the beginning of this tale. But it is now eminently feasible. The 500 years that separate us from these affairs have clouded the information, mixed up the traces, and obscured events and characters of whose existence we may never be sure. Nevertheless, we can clearly see that the ingredients that would make this story possible are present. There remains just one loose end: the age of the shroud.
The carbon-14 method tells us that the Holy Shroud's canvas predates the life of the Vinci. Its origin lies sometime between the years 1240 and 1400. This would utterly destroy the Leonardo theory, but in the end, it is a poor argument. A genius like Leonardo would never have used a canvas from his own times, but would have looked for an aged one. It was not unusual at that time to import fabric from the Middle East, and getting hold of one would not be a major problem for the powerful families close to Leonardo.
Benefits for the powerful, more credible relics, temporal coincidences, possible experiments. Leonardo really might have made a replica of the Shroud of Turin. If he did, we will never know if he was satisfied with his work. History sometimes hides information to preserve its mystery. But if we suppose for a moment that this is really what happened, as far as we know, Leonardo da Vinci never suffered reprisals, nor was he exposed publicly. And Leonardo had made his most ingenious experiment and his most miraculous work of art.
One might ask if it is faith that begets the miraculous in an object, or if the miraculous object begets faith. This paradox becomes even more significant if we think that, whether false or authentic, the Holy Shroud reflects its creator. Even today, the shroud is kept as a sacred relic, even though its present custodians do not dare to assert its authenticity. Hence, Leonardo could have looked upon the canvas with the satisfaction of a job well done.
Knowing the secrets of the shroud's origin does not resolve the paradox. In questions of faith, there is never one answer, just as there are no final truths. For science, however, the shroud is still the object of repeated and contradictory experiments. We can be certain, however, that delving into the mysteries of the Holy Shroud opens up a range of dark intentions and enigmas, many of which lead us deep into the life and soul of Leonardo da Vinci. Perhaps we can conclude that the reality of the shroud lies in both the heart of the believer and the formula of the skeptic. In some place in time, Leonardo is grinning.
The following documentary deals with subjects that may upset certain members in the audience, as it presents possible interpretations of historic facts. The conclusions presented here are a matter of opinion. The evidence is real. In 14th and 15th century Italy, there lived a deep and original character. A man of uncommon intellectual and creative daring. As a scientist, inventor, and artist, he was ahead of his times. And, judging from many of his discoveries, perhaps ahead of ours as well. He was involved in many more activities than is known, and undoubtedly his most hidden side was also his most interesting. A dark side with intriguing enigmas and dark revelations. A maze that outlines the strange life of Leonardo da Vinci.
The many facets of Leonardo da Vinci are veiled in darkness. Strange searches, unspeakable cults, unbridled ambitions. A combination of elements that gives us an inkling about the real scope of his secret activities. A disparate world, unified by an underlying logic. His participation in secret societies. His exploration of the world of stars and the natural world. And his eternal pacts were all connected.
His connection to astronomy was probably due to three of his obsessions: darkness, light, and shadow. Leonardo resolved to study meticulously the positions of the sun and the stars. This might have disturbed his collaborators. Now Leonardo was venturing into what was then called the terrain of the divine. A space ruled only by God and the angels. Using only his vision and an intelligence that even today leaves us speechless, Leonardo arrived at conclusions that, years later, would be reached by famous astronomers like Copernicus or Galileo Galilei. He who has beheld the sky once cannot cease to do so. Leonardo da Vinci.
Leonardo observed that the Earth and the Moon rotated around the Sun, and not the other way round as was thought at the time. Although today this may seem obvious, in those days this simple statement was enough to provoke a charge of heresy. Christianity maintained that God was the sole creator and at the center of the universe. Any other explanation clashed with the divine plan. For this reason, scientists spoke of their theories in hushed tones, like secrets that could not be confessed.
Like the moon, the Earth is one of the many stars that reflects the light of the sun. Leonardo da Vinci. Religion supported a geocentric model inherited from Greeks such as Ptolemy. The geocentric model believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. The explanation was that planet Earth had been the one chosen by God for man's soul to find salvation. The cosmos was a vast stage where through effort and pain, humanity could be redeemed. It was clear to Leonardo that the astronomical model that best explained the movement of the planets was heliocentric. The idea that the sun did not revolve around the Earth, but that, indeed, just the opposite was the case, entailed a deep theological rift with the Church. The planet that God had chosen would no longer be at the center of the universe, but just another celestial body. This cast doubt on creation as described in the Bible, and therefore on the whole Christian doctrine. The impact of Leonardo's revolutionary thinking is even greater when we recall what was taking place with his contemporaries and those who dared to devise similar theories in later centuries. Copernicus had to publish his discoveries posthumously and in Latin to avoid persecution. His book was banned by the Church. Galileo Galilei was persecuted, jailed, and forced to recant to avoid ending up burnt at the stake. And more than 100 years after Leonardo, the Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno was tortured, his tongue perforated with iron and his jaw sealed before being burnt at the stake for defending the ideas of Copernicus, Galileo, and Da Vinci. Earth is neither at the center of the sun's orbit nor at the center of the universe, but rather amid all the elements of the world. Leonardo da Vinci.
Europe was not quite ready for major discoveries. Those who wanted to study in fields that touched on the mystical had to keep quiet and stay in the shadows. In his thirst for knowledge, Leonardo became a part of this minority. And he knew, like everyone else, he had to be careful.
To avoid the persecution of the Church, those who decided to venture into knowledge were forced to create and form part of secret societies where they could carry on their investigations without suffering the consequences. The first suggestions of a connection between Leonardo and secret societies appears in a pictorial work with an esoteric and orientalist feel. This work, attributed to Leonardo, was painted at the Sforza Palace in Milan. It is known as Leonardo's Sala delle Asse.
The Academy was a spiritual brotherhood that preserved and guarded secrets of a scientific, religious, and spiritual nature. Becoming a part of the lodge was extremely difficult, as its codes and methods of security were quite hermetic. Joining required an arduous preparation and a rigorous initiation process. To be initiated meant having explored a deep spiritual path of sacrifice and meditation in order to reach higher spiritual states.
Etymologically, to be an initiate means to be inspired. And more precisely, it indicates those who know how to keep quiet, persons willing to know and keep ancient secrets, and to tirelessly deepen their studies. Once inside the society, the initiates had access to revelations and truth that few would come to know. Revelations connected to humanity's great mysteries. The path to initiation was represented by the figure of the maze.
Indeed, the labyrinth was the crucial test for reaching the center of truth, the heart of the Academy. Those who were able to get through had completed the initiation and were worthy to join this secret society. But those who entered this labyrinth had to confront a series of strange mental and physical trials and would never come out the same.
When Leonardo arrived in Milan in 1482, the city was in the process of becoming the great power in Italy, under the control of the Sforza family. Leonardo was at their service for 18 years, until 1500 at the Sforza castle, the center of the court. It was there that Leonardo made his major work and legacy. There is a great deal of evidence that Leonardo had disciples in Milan. For them, he is likely to have written the texts that would later be compiled in a treatise on painting published in the 17th century.
Knots, lassos, connections. This peculiarity might account for the fascination he had with the arabesques he is said to have made at Sforza Castle.
Sala delle Asse, which is credited to Leonardo, has all the features of a hermetic work of art. Its weaves make up endless mazes, complex network of swirls, a tangle of trees whose branches are extraordinarily and yet rationally interwoven. In addition to the knots of branches, there are clusters of rope, which resemble those in other esoteric prints, especially those by German artist Albert Dürer.
These curious patterns hide
Eastern esoteric messages that cannot be deciphered even with all the information available today. The only thing we can be sure of is Leonardo's unstoppable attraction to the clandestine, the out of reach, the enlightenment at the end of the labyrinth.
The sects from Leonardo's times replicated the methodology and structure of the Egyptian Hermetic schools, whose name comes from Hermes Trismegistus, the name that the Greeks gave to the Egyptian god Thoth. Thoth was the god of the word and magic formulas, that is to say, the god of knowledge. The term Hermetism comes from the name Hermes, and his name is associated with initiate secrets that have not been nor will be revealed. The internal rules were rigorous, and initiates who broke certain oaths could even lose their lives.
Over the centuries, secret societies have changed their names and tendencies. Today we know a great deal about the Templars, the Masons, and even the Rosicrucians. But we know practically nothing about the Priory of Zion.
Its name was not heard until the mid-20th century, though its history goes back for centuries. The Priory of Zion is one of the great secret passages in the maze of Leonardo da Vinci. In him, we find a grand master, leader and guide.
What did this brotherhood believe, and why was it kept secret for so long? Does the Priory still exist? The scant information we have about this sect gives us a clue. A clandestine world whose laws might be as strict as the official dogma. What was the relationship between Leonardo da Vinci and the Priory of Zion? The connection between Da Vinci and this sect first came to light in 1975, when some documents were uncovered at the Paris National Library. These documents are currently known as the Secret Dossier, and in them the name Leonardo da Vinci appears as Grand Master, that is to say, supreme head of the Priory of Zion.
Those who doubt the truth of the Dossier Secret accuse three Frenchmen fascinated with enigmas and mysteries: Gérard de Sède, Pierre Plantard, and Philippe de Chérissé, of writing the documents and devising an enormous fiasco. Despite these doubts, one thing is for certain. The information held in these dossiers opened up the gates to a compelling enigma and revealed the deeply heretical aims of the Priory of Zion.
How is it possible that Leonardo, often the official artist of the Catholic Church, could be the head of a heretical sect? If these documents were authentic, we would be before impressive evidence. Evidence, however, that we no longer find too astonishing.
It is impossible to speak of the Priory of Zion without mentioning the Order of Zion. The origins of the Order of Zion go back to the First Crusade. In 1099, a group of Calabrese Augustan monks support the candidature of the Franco-German Duke Gottfried of Bouillon for the throne of the besieged Jerusalem. During the same era, when the Crusades reached Jerusalem, an order of the Poor Knights of Christ, more widely known as the Knights Templar, was formed. This was an order of warrior monks created by Frenchman Hugo d'Épée and 9 other knights whose supposed aim was to protect the Christian pilgrims traveling to visit holy places. It is thought that the two organizations, the Order of Zion and the Templars, were closely connected at the beginning. The Templars' luck lasted until 1300, when the King of France, Philip the Beautiful, who 1 year before had taken the wealth and property of French Jews to finance his debts and new crusades, accused the Templars of heresy, sodomy, and idolatry, unleashing a true witch hunt. Though the King of France appropriated the wealth of the order, he had to share it with the Church. Many Knights Templar perished at the stake after being tortured, including a Grand Master, Jacques de Molay. Many others survived, mostly in exile in Great Britain and Portugal. It was in Portugal that they changed the name to form the Order of the Knights of Christ. Although the Order of the Templars was through, the secret, whatever it might be, was still kept by its successors and survivors. It is believed that that is the actual mission of the Priory and the Order of Zion.
For centuries, the Priory of Zion has guarded a secret so dark and dangerous that if verified, it would permanently change the essence of Christianity as we know it. An idea that threatens a crucial column of Christian doctrine and faith.
Many have speculated about the treasure of the Templars. Some hold that it was the head of Christ or of John the Baptist. This theory is supported by the declarations of tortured Templars who confessed to worshipping the bearded head of an idol whom they called Baphomet. Others say that they had the Holy Shroud, the cloth in which Jesus' body was wrapped before resurrection. But the theory that has given rise to the greatest number of fantasies holds that in the ruins of Jerusalem, the Knights Templar might have found certain documentation that supports the forbidden Gospels that gave another version of the life of Jesus. A version that would have questioned the tenets of the official church, an institution that was increasingly wealthy and powerful. A version that spoke of a marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and, even more shockingly, of a child whose divine lineage would be enough to topple the temples once again.
In the version of events that the official dogma considered so dangerous, Mary Magdalene bore Jesus' child in her womb. The Priory's mission was to protect Jesus' lineage, which they claimed continued into the present day.
The Brotherhood maintains that fleeing from the Romans and Pharisees, Mary Magdalene reached southeast France pregnant. She lived there for many years after Jesus' crucifixion. One of her descendants, Merovech, founded the first dynasty of Franco kings, the Merovingians, which ruled from the fall of the Romans until 751 Anno Domini.
It's just a hypothesis, but let's just imagine for a moment what would happen if Jesus had had children, and those children in turn had living descendants. That would mean that currently there's an almost divine lineage, the genetic map for the Son of God.
Marseille, on the southeastern coast of France, is considered the most esoteric region in Central Europe. And there are recurring allusions to Mary Magdalene there. Indeed, there is assorted and proven evidence of her arrival. She is often represented in the names of churches, chants, and legend. But above all, a name comes up in relation to the figure of the Black Virgins, who for many was the Black Maid. Strangely enough, in this region next to every Black Virgin, there is a mention of John the Baptist, the other biblical figure who is repeatedly and uniquely present in the work of Da Vinci. It is easy to observe how the famous gesture of John is repeated like an unmistakable sign of Leonardo's devotion to this saint, around whom several Christian sects were formed. After the destruction of these sects, hermetic societies were founded that defended the principle that John the Baptist and not Jesus was the true Messiah of the Jews.
The pieces of the puzzle are beginning to come together. An arcane sect, the Priory of Zion, a revelation, the lineage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and John the Baptist, the saint of the sects. a figure that Leonardo represented in all his religious work.
If it existed, a lineage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene would be cataclysmic for Christian dogma as we know it. Jesus' direct descendants could demand to run the church. And if the church refused, believers themselves would seek them out. If this were the true secret of the Templars, the mission of the Priory of Sion, which Leonardo allegedly led, would be nothing other than protecting the life of the descendant of the Savior and transmitting it in code from one generation to another, like eternal guards of the children of God.
It's reasonable to assume that Leonardo scattered hidden symbols in his work in order to leave a sign of his membership, a sign addressed to the brotherhood to which he belonged, conceived so that only other members of the Priory of Sion would grasp it.
The list of people that ruled the organization includes major figures like Isaac Newton, the famous writer Victor Hugo, the musician Claude Debussy, the artist Jean Cocteau, and the painter Sandro Botticelli, a contemporary of Leonardo. The rest of the list consists of members of the most important aristocratic families in Europe, along with known alchemists and occultists. In our times, the leadership of the Priory of Sion has been assumed by a French citizen named Pierre Plantard de Saint-Clair. He claims to be a direct descendant of the Merovingians and to have in his hands the treasure of Templars Plantard and Saint-Clair, two surnames closely linked to the priory and to the region of France where the treasure of the Templars is said to be hidden. This is also the region where, strangely enough, one can find the Tour Magdala, or Mary Magdalene Tower.
It is said that many of these families have a connection with Rennes-le-Château, a French village that belonged to the House of Lorraine, an old family of the Merovingian dynasty that fought to protect its lineage. There are those who assert that many of the names on this list were related, by blood or by friendship, to that dynasty. How did Leonardo da Vinci come to preside over such a distinguished and powerful sect?
Each Grand Master had direct contact, whether by blood or by friendship, with the one who came before and after. Once again, according to the Dossier Secret, Sandro Botticelli, the great painter, was the prior who passed rule on to Leonardo da Vinci. They were not strangers. For many years before, Botticelli and Leonardo had known each other. In their early years, they had both worked at the same studio in Florence, the capital city of occult Europe.
Actually, Leonardo da Vinci was on a mission. The artist, inventor, musician, cook, philosopher, spiritual rebel had a mission, and much of his life revolved around that mission. For in his time, Leonardo da Vinci was Grand Master of the Priory of Sion, a direct heir of the Knights Templar, keeper of the true religion of Christ and Mary Magdalene, repository of the Holy Grail legacy. And although as an artist Leonardo could put on a disguise, he would never betray himself. And that's why the true story, his authentic faith, shouts out from all his work. Even though he might later keep his mouth shut and even deny it, what was said was said.
There is a great deal of symbolism which indicates that Leonardo formed a part of secret societies that defended heretical ideas. We cannot leave out two examples. In symbolic code, the absence of the famous Grail in Leonardo's Last Supper can be interpreted to mean that Jesus' blood is in another vessel, and that this other vessel is Mary Magdalene, who would be the female figure to the right of the Messiah and who carried his regal blood in her womb. Royal blood, the eternal blood or Holy Grail. The chalice we do not see, but that Leonardo painted. Next, we have the constant and almost obsessive references to John the Baptist, the saint worshipped by sects and hermetic societies, even in paintings, where there is no discernible reason to include the gesture of John, as is the case in The Adoration of the Magi. In terms of Botticelli, in his work we find talismans represented in the form of the concealed letters X, signs of protection and good fortune in hermetic circles.
When Botticelli died, Leonardo took over the leadership of the Priory. But the duo had already become friends before joining the secret society. Their friendship was sealed by a tragic and ridiculous episode, one that could quite possibly never be confessed, but one that made them into lifelong accomplices.
Still a youth, Da Vinci worked as an apprentice in the studio of artist Andrea Verrocchio. There he would meet Sandro Botticelli. The grandeur of Florence and its strange inhabitants fascinated the young country boy Leonardo da Vinci. He spent his days in the workshop, surrounded by artists and wise men of every variety. Nevertheless, his restless spirit longed to meet more people and become familiar with more trades, to have conversations with all kinds of people. Also, he felt the need to increase his income in order to free himself forever from his distant father. And so, in the beginning of 1470, he worked nights as a waiter in the famous tavern, the Three Snails, located near Ponte Vecchio. But an unlikely event found him rising the ranks from mere waiter.
A new world opened up for Leonardo in the tavern's back room. An enthusiastic and open-minded, he quickly became an accomplished chef. But then fate opportunely played a deathly hand, and the future maestro was forced to use all of his creative powers in an unexpected and unfamiliar setting.
In the spring of 1473, death knocked on the door of the Three Snails Tavern. The victims were the tavern's three cooks. It is said that they had ingested a strange potion, but there was no further investigation.
Indeed, Leonardo's love of cooking even led him to open up a restaurant with an artist friend. The business soon had to close its doors when a nobleman was murdered on its premises, a common occurrence in a time when religion and money and magic and power were common fare at political banquets, and where dessert was often a drop of poison. But this was the Maestro da Vinci's world. He lived between the fire of the Inquisition and the poison of conspirators. He lived gracefully and without fear. And more than once, he used food to gain friends.
Soon after he had become head chef, Da Vinci began enacting changes. His aversion to the coarse dishes of the time would cause him to devise an original, almost strange cooking style. His dishes surprised and scandalized. However, his good taste was indisputable, and slowly but surely, customers succumbed to the pleasure of his experiments. Never in his long life would Leonardo give up the art of cooking, a magical space where he could create and recall his adventures as a tavern keeper. Mixing ingredients, preparing potions, creating strange reactions, or a new aroma, Leonardo felt like a wizard.
His increasingly bold culinary experiments ended up irritating the regulars, and his eccentricity, combined with the death of the chefs, which had never been fully cleared up, created a halo of suspicion around him. And hence, to his regret, Leonardo was forced to give up his job at the restaurant known as the Three Snails, and was soon focusing exclusively on the world of art once again. But later, a chance occurrence would force him back into the kitchen again.
Some time after Leonardo left the Three Snails, in the summer of 1478, a fight between the dinner guests caused a fire, burning the tavern to the ground. It was then that Da Vinci decided to reopen the tavern with Sandro Botticelli, his mate from the Verrocchio studio. They named it the Three Frog Insignia. Writings of the time, whose veracity is still debated, speak of a menu composed of exotic dishes like fish gelatin, horse soup, bear, and porcupine.
The crest of the Three Frogs proved too sophisticated for its times and soon had to close. But this experience of working in the kitchen affected Leonardo for the rest of his life. Though over the years he was praised and honoured for his artwork, he always happily returned to the kitchen, to the simple alchemy of pleasures that he found there.
By 1516, he was the most famous artist in Europe, recognized in all the royal courts and praised in all circles. His trips to the underground also brought him prestige and power. That year, the King of France, Francis I, invited the master to take residence in the Clou Castle near Amboise. Leonardo accepted and moved in with Salai, Francesco Melzi, his servant, and a couple of apprentices. It was certainly a splendid invitation, and it solved a number of problems for Leonardo. First, getting away from Florence, where he was already too well known. The city that he had loved so much now seemed hostile. Furthermore, being the honored guest of a king meant an end to his economic difficulties. But there was another reason. In addition to being an art aficionado, Francis I brought Calvinism to France and was thus naturally at odds with the doctrine from Rome. This probably provided Leonardo with the possibility of freely expressing his ideas without interference from the Church.
When Leonardo died in 1519, the Priory of Zion already had a successor, Connétable de Bourbon, to whom Leonardo had passed his mantle before dying.
As with the papacy, in esoteric orders, control is maintained until death. But unlike in Catholic convention, there is no conclave to select a successor. The former master must choose the great priors while alive. As with the occult schools in Egypt and Asia, this secret society stipulated the passing of rule from master to disciple to determine future leaders.
Leonardo spent the final days of his life far from Italy, in a peaceful and comfortable setting. He reflected on a fascinating life, full of ambitious goals that to a large extent he'd been able to achieve. He had questioned the laws of God, of nature, and of art, and survived. But like all artists, he left an unfinished work. The final answer, the formula for life. What secrets did he take to the grave? How many did he leave behind to be deciphered in the future? As a visionary, what did he predict for the future? His final days attest to just how far Leonardo had come in his long life. Far from the humble village where he was born, that illegitimate child left this world, wrapped in riches and comforts. in a grand palace, surrounded by people of influence and nobility, who admired and looked after him.
They also say he refused to sleep, saying that it was too much like death. Oh, why will you not produce a work that, after your death, will provide an image of the perfect life? You, who while alive, become in sleep so much alike the gloomy dead? Leonardo da Vinci.
Clos Castle was full of people who wanted to be near Leonardo. Artists from across Europe, sculptors, jewelers, servants, aristocrats, even breeders of exotic birds. But the artist preferred the company of his closest circle.
If you are alone, you are your sole owner. Leonardo da Vinci. Following the master's instructions, his assistants had to document every change they noticed in his health. The color of his skin, his posture, his mood. They had to record even the smallest changes that took place in his body as it wound down the road to death.
His obsession with science went beyond the human. Even as Leonardo experienced the suffering of death, he made sure that notes were taken on his physical deterioration and his changing moods. Perhaps he was attempting to make himself into the object of his own study, and thus elude fate.
Days before his death, Leonardo called upon a notary, with whom he drew up his will and left precise instructions regarding his funeral. Strange conditions and elaborate arrangements were demanded, as if death were the last great mystery which he was finally reaching.
In the will that Leonardo wrote with his notary, he left all the money that he had deposited at the Ospedale Bank in Italy to his half-brothers. The belongings that he had in the castle, which included some manuscripts and some pictorial works, he would leave to his faithful assistant, Melzi.
His assistant Salai and his other servant Battista each inherited a half of his vineyard in Milan. For his servant Mathurin, he leaves some coats and money, and saw to it that gold was handed over to 62 Ambrosian beggars. He also requested that 60 of them carry a torch during his funeral. As part of his final mystical master plan, Leonardo even documented the number and weight of the candles that would burn at Mass the day of his burial. The old artist staged a truly grand event for the final celebration of his life.
We will never know for sure whether these requests were part of a plan to gain access to the afterlife. Perhaps he had an unspeakable theory about the soul's passage. We'll never know. There is, however, something in his final works that makes us shudder.
It is said that Leonardo spent his last days in France, dedicated to his manuscripts, correcting and modifying old texts, penning here and there new thoughts and old dilemmas. It is during this time that his sketches of the end of the world were made. Perhaps, as a result of his feverish visions, Da Vinci drew an apocalyptic world where enormous floods left a wake of destruction. Forests, cities and knights all ended up buried under a watery torrent. One interesting detail in the natural phenomena in these nightmarish, hallucinatory sketches is their departure from the master's lifelong obsession with detail and the idea of nature. With his last breath, the master made confession before a priest who absolved him and gave him communion. With his remaining strength, Da Vinci rose from his deathbed to accept the host. He was unable to stand up without the support of his assistants. They say that in his confession, he asked for forgiveness for not having produced art according to convention.
Asking for forgiveness on his deathbed, and the confirmation that his work had not been carried out as agreed, are just two of the things that make us suspect something. Perhaps he was referring to the time he took to make his work, or perhaps something entirely different. We will never know.
At the time of his death, Da Vinci had 3 works with him: St. John the Baptist, St. Anne, and that famous portrait of the smiling woman that some claim is the true Gioconda. The choice was by no means left to chance.
Why these pieces, not others, were hanging before him at the time of his death is another mystery that he took to the grave.
These paintings would act as the final message of his life and beliefs for posterity. John, the saint of the secret societies. St. Anne, the figure of the Great Mother. And the Gioconda, this androgynous image, as enigmatic as he was.
Leonardo da Vinci died with dignity and without show. But of course there is one final mystery surrounding his death: the fate of his mortal remains. There are many differing theories about what happened to Leonardo da Vinci's body.
The maze of the master's life reached its end. His disciples, followers, students and successors probably didn't have Leonardo's astuteness when it came to studying and passing on secret knowledge. And centuries had to go by before, through Leonardo's work and its secret science, we could begin to get a glimpse of the secrets so jealously guarded by the Templars, Priors, and other mysterious sects.
His life's curtain fell on French soil, and beyond that curtain, eternity. Finally, Leonardo would come to know what lay beyond life. Reclining in his chambers in Clou Castle, with no natural heirs and his will in order, Leonardo had time to prepare his mind for the great passage.
Attempts at flight, his hidden relations, secret rituals, unfinished work. The work of art he would never make. All that was behind him, in his past. Before him, the window on the night, the vastness of the French sky, the glimmer of the stars which he always dreamed of reaching. Those stars that now moved toward him with a new glow. And Leonardo felt light, so light.
His powerful intellect, his strong will and optimism, and his love of nature and humanity all put him face to face with God. Man and God, made in the likeness and image of each other.